Speaker of the day, Dr. Laura Franklin Hall is Associate Professor of Philosophy at NYU. She holds a PhD in philosophy from Columbia and a BS in biological sciences from Stanford. And she's interested in problems in the philosophy of biology, the general philosophy of science, and metaphysics. She's the author of several papers in philosophy journals, such as Philosophy of Science, British Journal for the Philosophy of Science, Biology and Philosophy, and Phil Studies, as well as in biology journals such as Journal of Neurochemistry, Neuroscience Letters, Neurochemical Research, and Biology Direct. Help me in welcoming Laura.
Thank you very much. There is a handout up there. It isn't critical, it's just sort of an outline of the talk. And there may not be enough, but you're not missing out on much if you get one. So I'll be talking about the animal sexes and sort of what they really are. And I'm going to be arguing that they are historical explanatory kinds.
You get this first. Oh, no, you can help me. I can't.
So I'm going to start with some preliminaries. So I'm going to be talking about the animal sexes and not gender. Just as worth saying from the outset, I'm understanding sex as a biological property, either functional or evolutionary. Examples of sexes are male, female, and hermaphrodite. The category sex applies in some way to organisms across the tree of life. Gender, by contrast, involves something like social roles or personal identifications. Examples of gender categories are man, woman, boy, girl. Wakashu, in Japan, sometimes called third gender. It centrally and perhaps exclusively applies to humans. And so there are complicated questions about how these things are related. It's supposed to be shown by the arrows and the question mark. But again, my focus will just be on sex itself. Okay, so if I'm going to be talking about the animal sexes, the category of the animal sexes, the first preliminary is to say something about what animals are. So animals are metazoans, which is a monophyletic group of multicellular eukaryotic organisms. So you might have thought that animals just, all resembled one another in some ways, but they actually had distinct evolutionary origins, but they don't. All animals have the same origin. They first differentiated about 600 million years ago, and they vary widely. The sponge, some people might have not thought was an animal, but it is. The wombat, sea cucumber, atlas beetle, ourselves, of course. Okay, so what are the animal sexes? Well, there are at least two different notions of sex that you could apply to animals. One would be a species-level categorization of animals, such as the male elephant beetle and female elephant beetle. So the category male elephant beetle is, just involves all of the male elephant beetles. The cross-animal sexes, which is actually what I'm going to be talking about, shown on the right, involves taking all of the animals and then taking all of the males in among the animals. And it's that big, sort of wild category with many different kinds in it that constitutes the cross-animal males, cross-animal or cross-animal females. Okay, so with that sort of, keeping in mind this is quite an enormous category, the one that I think biologists and evolutionary biologists in particular do theorize about. What distinguishes male animals and female animals? So one, intuitive first pass, you might think would be genetics. Maybe the female animals are those with a particular chromosomal type, such as having two X chromosomes, and males with an X chromosome and a Y chromosome. But as many of you will already know, this can't possibly suffice as a kind of distinguishing feature of the male animals. The sex determination systems, that is what is about an organism that leads it to become either male or female, vary widely across animals. Sometimes it's genetics and particularly the XX-XY system, but other times it's an environmental feature, such as whether or not you landed in a particular location where there are other animals of a particular sex around. So the green spoonworm will turn female if its larva lands on an unoccupied bit of ocean floor, but male if it lands in proximity to females. Other species determine sex by temperature, so there are no genetic differences. And other species use genetics, but a different system than the XY system. Another, possibly first pass would be there are sort of systematic anatomical differences between males and females. So perhaps, only males have an intermittent organ or penis, and only females don't have one. So there are lots of problems with this kind of approach to the male-female distinction. External fertilizers, don't have penises of neither sex. In birds, the same, although they're internal fertilizers. And then in insects, in one particular species of cave bark lice, the females have the penis, and the female inserts her penis into the male and then sucks up his sperm. So what does distinguish male animals and female animals? Well, actually, perhaps surprisingly, biologists have settled on a very simple definition that they say really is the determining factor, the determining feature of male and femaleness. So Joan Roughgarten, who is in many respects a kind of skeptic of the sex categories, still, among all the people who aren't sort of skeptics of it, still endorses the simple view. Male and female are defined by a binary distinction between small and large gametes, sperm and egg. So the idea is, animals are all anisogamous, which means that they reproduce via segregating half of their chromosomes into a packet, either a large or a small one, and to reproduce, a large one and a small one have to join together to form the new organism, rather than having two cells that combine, which are of approximately the same size, which are called isogamous. And among these anisogamous organisms, to be male is just to be that organism that contributes the small gamete rather than the large gamete, and female the reverse. And so this is another quote from a biologist: female gametes are larger than male gametes. This is not an empirical observation, but a definition. So this is sort of just really uncontested. One question you might ask is, to whom does the standard apply? I already mentioned isogamous organisms. So the standard doesn't, at least directly in a simple way, apply to hermaphroditic organisms, those in which individual organisms can produce either the large or both the large and the small gametes, either sequentially, maybe when they're young they produce one and old another, or at the same time. It doesn't naturally apply, or it doesn't apply at all actually, to asexually reproducing organisms, those that reproduce by fragmentation or parthenogenesis. We can come back to parthenogenesis. Actually, parthenogenic organisms are usually considered female, which is a little bit puzzling on the standard biological definition, but actually in my proposal, you can make sense of why biologists do call parthenogenetic organisms females. And 95% of animals, so you might say, and so the biologist standard applies just to this dioecious or gonochoric organism, those that they're anisogamous, they reproduce sexually, and they either produce small or large gametes over their lifetime. And you might think, well, this is sort of uninteresting. Look at this chart, and there's so many different categories, and the biologist's definition only applies to this subset, but it is still 95% of animal species that fall into this category. So it's still sort of an interesting, I think, grouping to look at. I should say that this number is inflated by the familiar fact that there are many, many beetles, and so beetles are dioecious, so that this is inflated, but it would still be like in the 70-something percentile, even if beetles were put aside. Okay, so some have argued against the cross-animal sexes being explanatory kinds. And so this kind of argument is most clearly in Dupre, but Richardson, who also writes about sex, endorses it. So in the background question is, so biologists have this definition of the sexes. Is this a explanatory kind at all, or is it simply a definition that doesn't have any further explanatory use? So Dupre starts with a model of intrinsic kinds. So an intrinsic kind you'll probably be familiar with. It's one that is defined by a key intrinsic property that's common to only and all kind members, and explains, at least in part, other frequent features of kind members. This seems to fit well with certain classic examples, like gold is a chemical element. All gold atoms have 79 protons, and this can explain ultimately via the electronic structure of having so many protons, their reflectivity, their malleability, their conductivity, other features. Now this doesn't, straightforwardly, and this is what Dupre presses, apply to these cross-animal sex categories. So being male, having a small gamete doesn't itself, in the same way that possessing 79 protons does sort of account for other properties that males might have, like growing facial hair in the human case. It happens that small gamete producers also produce certain more facial hair, but that isn't explained by the smallness of those gametes. And you might think, well, that's because really what explains the sex characteristics are just the genes of the particular males. They can commonly account both. They can account both for actually the gamete size and the other typical sex characteristics. But as you'll already know from what we talked about before, that won't really work as a potential explanation for any cross-animal sex characteristics, because, as we saw, that there isn't any genetic, at least, trigger that's in common between males across animals or females across animals. So this seems to be a non-starter, says Dupre. Another possibility, another just thing worth pointing out is that sort of explanatory kinds are often thought to have strong regularities associated with them. Like in the case of gold, the melting point of pure gold is 1,064 degrees Celsius. It has a certain elasticity. So there are all these patterns that are true of gold more or less wherever you find it, or at least in most of the cases you find it. Are there any strong regularities about the sexes? Maybe males are always larger, females always care more for young, males are always aggressive. As you might be expecting to hear, no, there might be some trends, but there are no universal differences between male and females within or across species beyond the gametic difference. So as Rothbard puts it, the biggest error in biology today is the uncritically assuming that the gamete size binary implies a corresponding binary body type, behavior, or life history. So the conclusion for Dupre is that the animal sexes are not explanatory kinds because they're not intrinsic kinds. And I just want to drive home this point about diversity, just because some might be, although it isn't critical to my overall message. The anglerfish, the male is this tiny creature that sort of bites on to the female, and as soon as he finds one, and then his neural system degrades, and then he just becomes a mobile sperm sac for her. So this is an example of male dwarfism. There's also male dwarfism among the blanket octopus. Of course, there are also cases where males are larger than females, much larger than in the human case, as in the elephant seal. So there aren't sort of strong patterns about the masses of different animals. Similarly with parental care. In the European earwig, the female does care for the young earwigs, but in the giant water bug, the male ferries the babies and the eggs on the back and aerates them. And then there are many species like our own with joint parental care, and the prairie vole is such a case as well. The seahorse is one that has joint care and male pregnancy where the males gestate the young. There's also diversity across animals in ornaments and armaments. You might, intuitively think, well, it's usually the male animal that has, or maybe always the male animal that's more decorated than the female. In the case of the painted snipe, though, and other shorebirds, the females are more decorated. They have more, distinctive coloration. And then, similarly, in the case of of armaments, such as having horns that you might use to fight, so that maybe more often it's the case that the male has it. But in the northern jacana, the female has wing spurs that she uses to fight other females for sort of access to males, and she'll usually have a harem of males that she's guarding. There's also diversity within each species as far as the characteristics that males and females have. But I'm not going to go into all of these, but just note that they exist. So the animal sexes are not explanatory kinds on this traditional model that Dupre puts out, because there's no intrinsic property of all animal males nor animal females that explain their other typical features. And consistent with this, there are no laws or strong generalizations true of males or females. Are the animal sexes then not explanatory or perhaps even scientific kinds at all? Perhaps there's no scientific interest in them, and our attention to them, or evolutionary biologists' attention to them, stems from projection of our outdated human normative social roles onto the natural world. So, so there are other cases in which people have talked about categories like hysteria or the races in some views, which philosophers or biologists have ultimately said, no, these weren't good categories. We should reject them. They were based on some kind of prejudice. These were supposed to fly away. And so maybe the animal sexes are like that. There they did it. Dupre doesn't explicitly reach this conclusion, but he sort of stopped short of providing any positive account of the animal sexes. So in as much as he sort of argues that the animal sexes aren't good intrinsic kinds, he sort of leaves this possibility open. So the alternative that I will pursue today, I should say, it isn't that Dupre doesn't endorse the intrinsic essentialist view as an account of what the natural kinds are. He has an extremely lenient account of what the natural kinds are. But he doesn't sort of go on to theorize about why all the things he says about the sexes seem to indicate that they're not of much scientific interest. So, and he explicitly reaches the conclusion they're not explanatory. So the animal sexes, properly understood, are a distinct species. This is what I'm going to argue, that they're a distinct species of explanatory kind, an explanatory type historical kind. Though my account is ultimately motivated by its consistency with biological practice generally, on my proposal, the nature of the animal male and animal female will turn out to be different than the biologist's definition suggests. So I'm going to sort of be arguing that male and female aren't actually defined by gamete size, though they will be extensionally identical, or most largely extensionally identical to them. And my sort of motivation for my proposal is that we can sort of make sense of the purported explanatory use of the animal sex categories among biologists who are theorizing about sex. Okay, so if I'm going to be arguing that the animal sexes are explanatory kinds, what is the explanandum? And so the explanandum is going to be the trends that we find in sex characteristics. So I just emphasized the diversity in the animal sexes, which I think is real and important to emphasize. But on the other hand, there is a kind of common package of sex characteristics that are found more often than not among animals. And so looking at the European earwig, which you'll be relieved to hear is not named because it goes in people's ears, but because its hind wing, when extended, looks a little bit like a human ear. So this creature, which there are a surprising number of videos on YouTube that show them fighting with each other. These are home videos. Shots. Well, I guess you're going to miss out on the fighting because I don't know how to function. I don't know how to work this. But so here's some characteristics that the earwig has. They're somewhat sexually dimorphic, with the males having sort of more of a defensive tail that they use to pinch others. The females are the only ones that are responsible for parental care, and the males do engage in reproductive competition in order to get access to reproductive partners, or perhaps to display their fitness for reproductive partners. This package where males are less reproductively discriminating, actually I didn't mention that previously, but the males will generally mate with an available female, whereas available females are more discriminating, and where males have more ornaments and armaments, whereas females are more reproductively discriminating and provide more parental care. This is a kind of common package, which controversially are called conventional sexuals, Darwinian sexuals, but I'm just going to call them the common package. I guess I twice put this on because I added this later on the slide. There are also some anatomical patterns or trends among the animal sexes. So males are despite the cave-dwelling bark lice, they much more commonly have intermittent organs. Much less commonly are involved in internal fertilization and gestation, whereas the reverse for females. These trends haven't been really well quantified by biologists, but it certainly seems to be like, for many of them, you're hard pressed to find examples, say, of like females with armaments, etc. So I think it seems safe to say that these are real trends, though I wish I could sort of more precisely quantify them. Anyways, just summing up the biological mood, there is a clear tendency in nature for males to compete more strongly for fertilizations than females, and there are systematic differences in male and female behavior captured by the umbrella term sex roles that need to be explained. So this sort of trend is something that biologists have fixated on, and then they aim to explain. And so what explanations do they give? So I'm going to start with a kind of not very good explanation, but it's sort of maybe the traditional one. So this one says, well, we can explain based on anisogamy, based on the size of the gametes, where the large gamete producer will benefit more evolutionarily by different other behavioral and anatomical strategies than will the smaller gamete producer. And this difference in optimal other characteristics, explains the suite of characteristics we tend to find today. So this kind of explanation is found both in contemporary behavioral ecology and evolution textbooks, as well as sort of in a more dramatic way in Wilson's On Human Nature. Here he's talking about humans, but he generalizes to all animals. The anatomical difference between the two kinds of sex cells, he says, is often extreme. In particular, the human egg is 85,000 times larger than the human sperm. The consequences of this genetic dimorphism ramify through the biology and the psychology of the human sex. The most important result is that the female places a greater investment in each of her sex cells. A woman can expect to produce only about 400 eggs in her lifetime. In contrast, a man releases 100 million sperm with each ejaculation. Thus, it pays males to be aggressive, hasty, fickle, undiscriminating. In theory, it is more profitable for females to be coy, to hold back until they can identify males with the best genes. So, just presuming you got the character of the explanation from that quote, the picture is that females, they produce larger gametes, and then presuming some sort of fixed investment possibility, they have fewer that they can produce. More matings for them won't produce more offspring because one mating would be sufficient to fertilize all their eggs, but better partners do increase their offspring survival because maybe they provide resources or genes that make the offspring better off. So they evolve reproductive discrimination. Whereas males have this virtually endless supply of sperm. More matings mean more offspring. So they evolve ornaments and armaments to maximize their mating success. Parental care would take time away from mating, thus we should avoid it. This direct anisogamy explanation isn't actually the one that's endorsed sort of today by biologists, and certainly philosophers have been critical of it as well. It just doesn't seem like a mere difference in gamete size or even gamete number can explain differences between the sexes. After all, consider the diversity in the sexes we've already reviewed. A male snipe is also in principle, so the male snipe was the one that he broods eggs that are laid by the female and sort of doesn't have as many offspring as a female partner in his species. A male snipe is also in principle able to fertilize with those females, but he doesn't try. This isn't presumably because he has simply failed to evolve the optimal strategy. Even in those species in which males and females do display the common package of characteristics, differences in gamete size are usually trivial compared to other differences that, according to current theory, are more important in explaining sex differences in behavior. So you'll notice that in the quote from Wilson, he started off by the extreme gamete size difference between males and females, but there are also lots and lots of other differences between males and females, such as gestational differences and lactation differences in the human case, that totally swamp the investment differences between the gametes. So sort of fixating on the gametic size difference, if you're talking about the current optimal strategy for males and females, seems like it's pointing at something that isn't really a difference maker for the optimal strategy that males and females might have, and thus can't really be the explanatory feature. So now I'm going to sketch out a kind of alternative picture for what explains these loose trends in sex differences. So the linchpin of current explanations of behavioral sex differences, now this isn't going to account for the anatomical differences that I also mentioned, is parental investment theory. So parental investment theory, parental investment is investment or resource use by the parent in an individual offspring that increases the offspring's chance of surviving at the cost of the parent's ability to invest in other offspring. So the theory goes, when there is no or very little investment in offspring except for the gametes, species conform to the common pattern, putting aside the parental care part because that's absent here. But in a variety of conditions, additional investment in offspring is adaptive, and when it evolves, what matters in explaining trends in sex difference is overall parental investment. That is investment in gestation, gamete production, resource provision, parental care, all of these things. And overall investment, just because gametes are such a small part of what lots of species provide to their offspring, can be the reverse of gametic investment. So why should overall investment matter? So this is something you might already be familiar with from, evolutionary biology generally. There's a kind of positive feedback between parental investment provided by sex A and sexual selection in sex B. So sexual selection you might be familiar with from the peacock kind of example. So why do male peacocks have these large tails? Well, it's because having such a large tail will lead them to attract more female partners, and thus they'll have more offspring. And it isn't because the tail is doing anything else for them, like allowing them to survive longer, it's just allowing them to get more mates. So how does this feedback relationship work? Well, when sex A is doing more parental investment, this takes time out from mating and leads to a biased operational sex ratio. That is the ratio of males and females that can mate at any given time. And thus there'll be more sexual selection on the less invested and more often available sex. The sex that is more common in the mating pool will stand to benefit more from soliciting more matings because they have to work harder to get a mating given the unequal sex ratio. This is actually only one kind of causal path here, but there are others. And then on the other side, sexual selection can lead to the evolution of energy-intensive adaptations, and given that there's sort of a fixed energy budget, parental investment ends up being more costly for that sex. So if you sort of have to invest in the ornaments in order to get any mates, then it's, investing in, maybe you'd be slightly better off investing in parental care or something else, but that would be more costly if you already have to. You can't give up on your ornaments, otherwise you'll get no matings at all. There are interesting mechanisms by which parental care becomes a sexually selected trait, but this is sort of a big picture. So when I was just describing this, I didn't talk about male and female. I just talked about which sex invested more and which sex invested less. And on this picture, there's at least two stable arrangements, one in which the female invests more and the male is more sexually selected, and the other the reverse. So the parental investment theory itself doesn't point to any sort of systematic bias in sex characteristics across animals. But though this toggle switch can have either sex in either position, when among other things there's sort of upstream evolutionary adaptations such as female internal fertilization, which has evolved repeatedly and independently across animals, males are comparatively subject to sexual selection and females to parental investment. And this is because female internal fertilization, absent other adaptations, leads to comparative uncertainty in male parentage and decreasing the adaptive value of care. So if the female can be sure that the juveniles are her own when she produces them, at least at first. Whereas the male is unsure of that, so it's you have to have more of a gain for the male in order for it to be adaptive for them to provide parental care, unless you have other mechanisms that have evolved that ensure male parentage. It also increases female internal fertilization, increases obligate parental investment on females. So this is just quickly sketching a lot of sort of upstream mechanisms by which adaptations that have evolved even before there was interesting parental care or sexual selection sort of biased the evolutionary trajectories across the animal tree, such that, though, again, there are two stable arrangements, and you do find species with males providing all the parental care and females not, it's more common that the toggle switch goes one way, with females providing more overall parental investment and males undergoing more sexual selection. This sort of overall picture has been called recently the sexual cascade. So we started off with this sort of relatively minimal differences between males and females, just in terms of their gonads and like the size of the gametes they produced. And then there were sort of downstream adaptations that often sort of, here I have the wide arrows being kind of higher probability events. This isn't a genealogical tree, this is just a kind of tree of adaptation or emergence. So female and turtle fertilization evolved many times, and then by that, the common pattern evolved many, many times. There are lots of ways that other things can evolve. If you have demanding ecological conditions, then you get lots of equitable care, and like our species is such a species, I think. And then when you have brooding, you end up with interesting other dynamics. But sort of there's been, we started off with this very minimal difference 600 million years ago, and then there were some downstream adaptations which were then explained by this gametic difference. And the gametic difference kind of came along for the ride. In some cases, it did more than just coming along for the ride, such as in birds, where the egg really is enormously energy intensive compared to the male gamete. But in some species, it just sort of came along for the ride. It sort of got entrenched, gametic size differences. But what really explains these differences sort of more directly are these downstream adaptations, but the whole cascade, in some sense, explains the overall trend. And you might ask if these are real probabilities, like starting off with just this minimal difference between males and females made these downstream adaptations more likely. It isn't just that it happened like on Earth, but this is a robust trend that would have happened even had things unfold slightly differently. You might wonder whether this is so robust that we could expect these patterns among alien life. And I've tried to get biologists to commit about this, like would we expect males and females with the same patterns? And they're not happy to like go on record, but I have gotten some uptake that they're interested enough, they're convinced enough about the robustness of these patterns that they think that anisogamy really was enough to get the ball rolling. So it more often really rolled in one direction, even had things been radically different, like it was a different experiment. So what role does the essential difference between males and females, small and large gametes, have in the explanation I just reviewed? Well, I see it as a historical condition, one that looks to be probable given that anisogamy may have evolved many times independently, that makes the evolution of the common pattern more probable. This often goes by way of other intermediate adaptations that themselves independently bias the lineage towards the common pattern. Okay, so with this picture of like the best explanation for trends in sex characteristics in mind, I want to use this explanation, which does involve anisogamy, to offer a distinct account of what it is to be male or female. And on my view, the animal sexes are going to be type historical kinds, but actually the type part of it is a little bit complicated. I don't know whether I'm going to have time to fully describe that part. Oops, I didn't start my stopwatch. How long do I have? 5, 10 minutes. Okay. So the programmatic idea on my view is we should understand male and female, not in terms of what kind of gametes they currently produce, but in terms of the type of historical origin that tends to lead, in concert with the laws of nature, lineages to evolve sexes that exhibit the common pattern. Such conditions provide part of the historical explanation for trends in sex characteristics that have already been described. And if we take this origin as the key or defining feature of the sexes, then the sexes will be, I submit, explanatory kinds. That is, they will be kinds whose key property explains to some degree many other features of kind members, though in a way different than key properties that are explanatory in the case of intrinsic kinds. So this is getting into the type token distinction, but here are two models of historical kinds that some of you may be familiar with. So the species are, at least by many biologists and almost all philosophers of biology, are considered to be token historical kinds. To be a pig is to be a descendant of a particular population, I don't know how many million years ago, 2 million years ago. So to be a pig is to be either part of some originating population and all of its descendants. And members of pigs resemble each other in virtue of the like inheritance of these characteristics. Now, there are also type historical kinds, which are kinds where it isn't a particular event and sort of the descendants or consequences of that event which define the kind, but instead having a particular, a kind of origin, not a token origin. So foliated metamorphic rocks are rocks that experienced high temperatures and high anisotropic pressures. They tend to be striated, like they have these line kind of appearance, due to the tendencies in recrystallization of minerals upon cooling. So to be an example of gneiss is not to have any particular chemical composition now, or at least that isn't all that it takes. It also, important is also that you happen to have experienced high temperatures and high anisotropic pressures. That's part of what it is to be an instance of gneiss, a nice instance of gneiss, or schist. But I mean, there isn't just one event of high anisotropic pressures and temperatures that will do. Any instance of anisotropic pressures and temperatures in your origin will make you gneiss. So that's the sense in which it's a type historical kind. And so this is just a kind of little map of what is different between token historical kinds. They both are defined in terms of something about their histories, but in the token historical kind, it's a particular origin, whereas in the type historical kind, it's a type of origin that's common to all kind members. Okay, so I've already said that I'm going to take the animal sexes to be historical kinds and type historical kinds, but what historical feature, type, or token of males and females could possibly suffice? After all, in contrast to species, males and females have, in a certain sense, the same origin in any given species. All organisms in a species have the same mix of male and female ancestors. And in contrast to metamorphic rocks, male and females aren't all produced by the same kind of process. Neither all males nor females share any particular genes or inciting cause of their maleness or femaleness. So, but I think there is an interesting sense in which male and female do have a common origin, and it's in short, they're homologous. But I'm not actually going to use that term because it's so vexed exactly what it means. But for those who are familiar with it, they're minimally homologous. There's something beyond that because animal males and females happen to be homologous, but I think male and female more generally, because their type historical, aren't homologous. But anyhow, those males and females have the same genealogical origins. The developmental processes that produce sex-typical features of males and females can be traced back to distinct developmental processes, those that biologists conjecture were activated in early small gamete-producing ancestors, ancestralist males, and others in large gamete-producing ancestors. So the idea is, males and females within a species, they both have largely the same biological background, but they activate different developmental processes, at least to some degree, with respect to their sex characteristics. And males and females, and this was true even, among the first males and females. And you can sort of trace the sort of trajectory of this process, of the male and the female process, as they've unfolded down the evolutionary tree. And it's actually having a developmental process that is continuous with that early male or female developmental process that makes an organism male or female today. So it's that an organism was brought about by a particular developmental process that has this interesting kind of historical origin. So it's consistent with males and females in a species having all the same ancestors that they still realize distinct kinds of developmental processes that are where those developmental processes are historically originated and distinct. And I have actually two pictures here to say that, and it happens that males and female animals do have the same origin, but I think on the explanatory story I suggested, it could have been that anisogamy evolved after animals evolved. And it would still be, we still would have expected the same patterns to emerge. And animals and females, the group of small gamete and large gamete producing creatures that had these particular kinds of historical origins of their developmental process would still be grouped together. So that's why I have these two distinct pictures here. So this slide is just telling you more about what the meaning of these. This diagram is these black arrows are reproductive lineages, and the pink and blue arrows are these developmental processes, the history of the developmental processes. So I said already that sex determination systems are rather distinct across animals, but there are downstream features of developmental processes that are similar across animals. And this is important not because it's critical to defining the sexes, but because it does indicate that there are real developmental lineages that do go back in time, so that my criterion would really pick out, really lead you back to the common origin of male and female developmental processes. So let me give a defense of this approach to biological sexes. First, you wouldn't want your account of the sexes, given that I'm trying to capture the real sexes in the world that biologists talk about, to not line up with the biologist's own preferred definition. But I think my account is largely extensionally adequate due to the developmental entrancement of gamete size. That is, it got fixed in biological lineages very early. The account of sex that I give is extensionally adequate. It lines up with the categories animal male and animal female that biologists claim to use themselves. But then the more interesting defense, sort of a positive reason in favor, is that the proposed key property, given the truth of the original anisogamy account, the key property that I give to the sexes is explanatory of trends in sex characteristics. Due to the apparently very repeatable convergent dynamics of sex character evolution, organisms produced by processes with these histories do tend to develop a common package of characteristics. Ducre's sort of intrinsic kind notion, he said that, look, the key property of animal males and animal females having a current gamete size doesn't explain anything else about them, so these aren't explanatory kinds. So my proposal is no, they are explanatory kinds, but there's a different key property, this historical origin, or this in fact type of historical origin that accounts for the trends in characteristics of males and females. So I sort of packed into the definition, or into the key property of the sexes, the characteristic that biologists say explain these trends, but it isn't current gamete size differences, it's these historical ones. So now I want to quickly go through a few objections. You might say, philosophers of biology tend to be sort of against defining kinds very narrowly. They say it's all very messy. They might say, aren't you taking on board a naive and outmoded presumption that complex biological categories have definitions, inferior, posteriori, or key characteristics? Why not see males and females as those that have some cluster of characteristics in loose homeostasis? So one reply is just consistency with use. Biologists themselves don't seem to understand the sexes in that kind of general way. They at least purport to have something more narrow to say. So I don't think that sexes are an interesting example of where doesn't seem like it's sort of some general homeostasis. And another thing, if you think of the sexes as a cluster of characteristics, you'd expect sex role reverse species, maybe those in which the males are the caregivers and are less decorated, etc. Maybe those should be cases in which what we call males should be redefined as females. Otherwise, after all, they're part of the female typical cluster, but there's no move among biologists to do that. Another thing is that I actually think the sexes might be special. It isn't always the case that a sort of narrow slice of the causal nexus has a huge consequent that gives you a big bang for your buck. But when it does, I think scientists take advantage of that feature in their categorizations and explanations. This isn't always available, and hence there are homeostatic kinds, but I think the sexes is an interesting case where there is this narrow feature in the distant past, 600 million years ago, that accounts for features we find today. And in cases like that, biologists do, or scientists, it pays for scientists to understand their categories in kind of a more strict way. Okay, because I'm running low on time, let me just mention another, maybe I think this is my final objection. You might say, well, so I said that, the objection is that, biologists are so adamant that the sexes are defined in terms of the gamete size. So doesn't that show that my account of the sexes has to be wrong? Aren't biologists the experts on the content of their categories? Well, I think that biologists could easily just be having. I do think that there's a constraint that biologists' own understanding of their categories provides. But what really matters is sort of consistency with the overall use of a kind in explanation and in the world. And when we take that broader perspective, my account is seems more attractive. But furthermore, there actually is a case in which the biologist's own definition seems to go against their categorization practices. So there are these cases of giant sperm, both in some roundworms and in fruit flies, where this The sperm is 6 centimeters long. It's extremely large. And there are also cases among roundworm where the male gametes are nearly as massive as the female gametes. Not quite as massive, but very close. Yet there's no move among the giants to call the giant sperm producing females, there's no move to call giant sperm producers female or small egg producers male. Instead, usage among biologists is consistent with what would be predicted by my account of the sexes. I also, and this is a little bit obnoxious for me to even put in, but I also have preliminary evidence that biologists working on the evolution of sex differences endorse my definition when presented with it. So I've been like, trying to ask people, like, so here's what I think, and what do you think? And I do think that in some sense, so I've gotten at least some uptake from biologists saying that this is more how I think of it. So this is just testimony on my part, or they're, testifying about other people's testimony. It isn't the case, if biologists, when they understood my account, still rejected it, then that would show that my account wasn't getting at the structure the biologists are really theorizing about. But they could be just using their gamete size definition as a kind of heuristic, and sort of their deep concept, actually involved this more complicated picture of what makes something male or female. I think I have something to say about whether the animal sexes so understood are actually natural kinds, but I think that's probably enough for us, so I will leave it there. Thank you very much.
Alrighty, so I'm going to keep it super brief so that everyone else can have a chance to ask their questions. I'm going to start with just sort of a quick summary of what some of the key points of the paper were for me, and then I'll pose a question that it raised and open up the floor. Franklin Hall proposes a novel account of biological sex according to which male and female are historical kinds. Members of these kinds are such by virtue of the fact that they share a certain developmental history with one another, one that can be traced to a common ancestor. This account is offered as an alternative to the kind essentialism, or what she called the intrinsic kind view, which holds that male and female sexes have intrinsic essences that are necessary and sufficient for membership in those kinds and explanatory of at least some of other kind-typical features. But as Laura already mentioned, difference in gamete size is the only sort of good candidate for an intrinsic essence of the sort required by the kind essentialist, and it also fails to explain sort of any other kind-typical features of males and females. It sort of fails us as a good explanatory account of the biological sexes, as Dupré points out, and Laura too. Unlike the kind essentialist view, Franklin Hall's historical account promises to do justice to the diversity across the sexes, while at the same time accommodating the explanatory role that they're thought to play in our scientific and epistemic practices. I think it's also worth noting, as she herself does, that the account allows for a bunch of diversity even within single species male and female sexes. So the account allows, for instance, that a given animal who has come to be by way of a female developmental path, yet for various reasons doesn't produce sex-typical gametes, still enjoys the status of a full-fledged female. I think that's a real virtue of the view. At the same time, the account fulfills its explanatory promise by accounting for the observable trends in animal sex difference. She mentioned those already, so for time's sake, I'll spare you. Now for my question. So, in a recent paper, John Dupré sort of similarly acknowledges that although there may be coarse-grained trends in developmental trajectories of males and females, there's also a great deal of variation. But somewhat differently, he underscores the influential role that environmental factors of various kinds can play on developmental outcomes. He goes so far as to suggest that human sex, in particular, may be just as shaped by environmental factors as gender, a type of classification that's arguably a sort of paradigmatic instance of what Franklin Hall calls a human-based interest grouping, which he talked about very early on. You might think sort of like pests. when it comes to the development of embryos with XX and XY chromosomes, Dupré writes that a strict and exhaustive dichotomy of outcomes is enforced at birth rather than supplied by nature. He poses the possibility that sex may one day be as varied as human sexuality. He writes, quote, "Nowadays it's common to distinguish not only straight, gay, and lesbian people, but also bisexual, transgendered, and queer, a category that is best defined by its refusal to accept a category. Actual developmental histories produce mixed and diverse object of sexual desire. Sexuality very possibly is leading the way where even sex may eventually follow," end quote. Franklin Hall admits that humans have most likely not followed the same relatively straightforward evolutionary trajectory that other animals have, a trajectory according to which, as she notes, sort of proceeded or sort of began with a very early ancestral sex difference, and that may have proceeded and created selective pressures for the next evolutionary transition, and so on and so forth until today. So now for my question. So it strikes me that Dupré's insistence on the importance of environmental factors on the developmental process or processes is perfectly compatible with Laura's account. If Dupré is right, though, and the environment plays just as important a role on the development of sex as it does on the development of gender, say, it would be interesting to hear more about how Franklin Hall's account accommodates this. And while her account of animal sexes perhaps accommodates well the fact of diversity, I wonder to what extent do various environmental factors also explain it. And as Dupré suggests, we have control over a significant number of these factors, factors that seemingly affect different outcomes of, you might think, human sex development in particular. And if that's the case, and if Dupré is right that the diversity of the human sexes might go the way of human sexuality, then could it be that the biological sexes cease to be explanatory in an increasingly tolerant and non-dichotomous cultural environment? Further, while Dupré doesn't deny that there may be some regularities across the animal sexes, a strong reading of his view might suggest that many of the observed regularities or similarities across animal sexes might also be attributed, at least in part, to environmental factors. And as Laura herself suggested to me in an earlier email exchange, this more extreme sort of view of the role that environment can play on sex development and developmental outcomes might pose a problem for her view. So, given a strong view of the environment's causal relation to sex, a historical kinds view of the sexes might wind up losing much, if not all of its explanatory force. But of course, whether or not there are good reasons to accept such a strong view, you might think is a separate question, but one perhaps worth thinking more about. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Yeah, so really interesting to connect the paper with Dupré's more recent theorizing about sex and gender. Actually, in our email exchange, I did say that the more the environment played a role in accounting for, we discussed the possibility that the more the environment played a role in accounting for sex differences within species, the maybe less explanatory power my account would have. But actually, I was just thinking about it. I mean, the developmental program, I didn't define it as intrinsic biological program. So in principle, if sex differences within species and also across species were partly underpinned by environmental differences between males and females, that itself would be consistent with the picture I suggest, because those environmental differences could be just part of the developmental package that sort of historically distinguishes males and females. Now, I mean, that isn't to say that there isn't an interesting question here. I mean, if sort of all the patterns we saw were not due to environmental influences that were part of this sort of developmental lineage that I talk about, but sort of things that cross-cut that lineage, and that explained lots of features of the animal sexes, then there'd be sort of more diversity, particularly in the species where that happened, perhaps our own. If you think a lot of human sex characteristics, sex differences are underpinned by environmental differences that are sort of not uniform. there'd be sort of maybe a little bit less for the account to explain, like there'd be fewer patterns. But I don't know whether, it still seems to be consistent with my overall picture, because my claim isn't that this historical origin explains all features of animal sexes. It's just that there's at least some interesting pattern there that can be accounted for by this deep historical event. If you thought that to have an explanatory kind, you had to have as part of your key characteristic sort of all the features that accounted for trends in the kind's characteristics, then even gold wouldn't end up being an explanatory kind, because it isn't just having a certain number of protons that accounts for its other characteristics. Also, other features of those atoms and the environment in which they are existing. So there's sort of maybe a question about the relative explanatoriness of the kind, but there isn't sort of qualitative question about whether it's explanatory that these kinds of environmental considerations bring up.
Alrighty, questions? We'll start in the back and do the same thing, work around. So Mehmet in the back.
I was wondering what you think about sex, like in Fisher's sex ratio theorem.
In what?
Fisher's sex ratio theorem.
Fisher's sex ratio.
Oh, okay.
So it strikes me that they are not historical kinds. The sex in the sex ratio theorem is not historical kind, but I do think that it does some explanatory work. So do you think that creates a problem with the account you are defending?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I don't think that the sexes in the sex ratio theorem have to be understood as male and female. Those will be any, I forgot the biological term now, but any time where you have two sexes, but they don't need to be identified as male and female in order for the theorem to work. All that matters is you have two of them, and that reproduction involves those two getting together.
Get versions of the model that you can talk about male and female.
Well, I guess maybe you could, but it doesn't seem to me the explanatory. If one of the two mating types is more common, it'll be selectively advantageous to the less common mating type. That sort of explanatory punch doesn't require anything about trends and characteristics, anything about the characteristics of those mating types. There are isogamous species that have different mating types, and the sex ratio theorem applies to them. So it can't be that maleness and femaleness is critical, at least the way I'm thinking of it, to how the theorem works, because it would apply to species even that don't have male and female, just as long as they're exclusive mating types.
Thanks. So, as you know, I really love the two ways of distinguishing between the different diachronic kinds. You mentioned that you had a story about why this was type rather than token historical kinds. Mm-hmm. And I suppose I'd like to hear it, so I'll explain why I'm a bit confused. So the sort of paradigm case is right. So a pig is a pig because it has a token origin, right? Whereas a bit of volcanic rock, doesn't matter which volcano it came from, just so long as it came from a volcano, it's type origin. When you're talking about the sex side, it's kind of interesting because you talked about biologists are cagey about whether or not this would happen in alternative lives, and you tend to think that it's not going to happen in an alternative life, which suggests maybe these dynamics somehow rely on the emergence of these dynamics, rely on some kind of deep homology which is distinctive of life on Earth or something like that. Then that seems very token historical kindy. But if it's going to come up, if it is going to turn up in alternative histories, then it's very type historical kindy. And so one thing might be going on is it turns out that whether it's type or token doesn't turn on, the way I've just framed it. Or it might be that it's kind of indeterminate at this point, like it's an open question whether or not it's a type historical versus token historical kind. So I guess, and there's probably some other options as well. So how do you play this out?
Well, yeah, the way you put it is, I think, what's at issue. There is, so the reason my official definition is an animal has to be brought about the developmental process has to be lineage continuous with one that brought about large or small gametes in its earliest animal ancestor. So actually, putting animal in there is already making a little bit token. But as I said, it could be the case that that animals differentiated and then anosogamy evolved multiple times. And so if that scenario had unfolded, then there's a sense in which, that shows there's a sense in which this is still a type historical kind of definition. But even it could be that we could understand animal in a less evolutionary sense, in which case, on this view, the descendant of an early, even in a different, on other planets that had multicellular organisms that we might identify as animals in some sense, that they might evolve the same package of characteristics, and it would make sense to categorize them together with animal males and females on Earth. So it's because of the repeatability of the process that I'm, according to the theory, that I want to understand it in terms of type historical kinds. So it seems like the explanatory punch doesn't come from anything token. It comes from the properties. And those properties it seems like would bring about these characteristics no matter what, or not no matter what, but in a large range of background conditions. Now there's a question about whether biologists themselves have a commitment about this. And so I don't think it is clear, and so in that sense, it could be indeterminate. But I want my account of the natural kinds not to be too tied to what biologists actually think. It should be sort of a normative one, like what are the real explanatory contours of these kinds? And sort of, if the process is repeatable like this, then it sort of explanatorily makes, from an explanatory point of view, makes sense for the kind to have this type historical character, where if even had anosogamy evolved later and then things had unfolded, it still would have been the case that all the animal males were part of the same kind, etc. Yeah, so you have a follow-up.
Yeah.
But there are lots and lots of cases where you have, an obvious one is like parallelisms, where you have repeated evolution of traits that seem to be, that trait is repeatedly evolving in the way that it is turned to extremely fine-grained features of the critter itself, which looks on TV to be more like a kind of mixed case, right? It looks like the sort of, in order to get the type, you have to delineate what you're talking about in a very, very specific way. Are you open to that, or do you want to insist that these are sort of kept separate?
Wait, I didn't quite follow.
I was thinking of cases like parallel evolution as opposed to convergent evolution, where you have, maxillary pedalism. So if you're a crab all the time, your front leaves will turn into feeding apparatus. That happens all the time, but it looks like it's like something to do with being a crab that makes it happen. So repeated evolution, but the explanation for the repeated evolution has a lot to do with, your token history. Is supposed to be the way that there's one way that we often think about that stuff, but it looks like it's a mixed case.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I'm open to that being a mixed case. It isn't the case that all kinds have to be definitively one or the other. Yeah. The question, in that case, it's sort of, you had to have this token crab background for this to happen. But here, you don't have to have the token anything background.
Any other questions? Yeah.
I have a very simple-minded question. In one of your last slides, you said that biologists call, that one, the larger gamete of that fly a sperm, even though they could have called otherwise, right? The reason why they called it a sperm, is it because of the homologies with other sperms, or is it, I wonder what's the ground, without knowing the history or the homological background to that type of entity, they would call it a sperm instead of the egg.
Well, I think the question about how, first let me say that it isn't the case, this isn't really that relevant, but some people may not know this, not all male gametes are sperm. So this is a case of sperm. So sperm is a kind of finer grained category than male gamete. And it is true, so on my picture, the reason why the large gamete producer is actually called male, even though like sort of on the technical definition it should be called female, is because of this historical origin of homology. Although it's, again, slightly weaker than homology. The fact that the sex characteristics of these creatures, though they've changed in interesting ways to be sort of more female-like, in that like the gamete has gotten larger, they still came about by this developmental process that has this particular kind of history. I should point out that like, some biologists, when faced with this giant sperm example, there are other giant sperm examples where this can't come up, will say, well, like, look, it's still smaller by mass, these giant sperm. So even on our official definition, they should be considered male. So these giant sperm are giant, but they're not more massive than the eggs, because the long tail is like extremely thin. But there are cases where it's even the mass of the sperm that's gotten large. I mean, yeah, why is putting aside the question about how to categorize the organisms, why call this thing a sperm? I mean, sperms, actually, I shouldn't know this, but I'm pretty sure sperm themselves do have a common origin. It's not a functional category. It's, to be a sperm is to be a reproductive cell that has evolved to have to swim via this flagella. So yeah, they're going to identify sperm based on their intrinsic properties, of course. But what makes them all sperm, at least arguably, is something about their history. I don't know, but I don't know if that's answering your question. I mean, we always infer history based on current properties, so that isn't surprising. But the more kind of the use of the giant sperm example in my argument was to say this looks like a case in which the biologist's explicit criterion has gotten reversed, yet usage doesn't go by way, doesn't reverse. Instead, it's still the case that the giant sperm producer is male.
Other questions? There's a hand over here.
Can we say that you are developing an argument in favor of
convergent evolution without directly mentioning convergent evolution? To me, it sounded like an explanation for patterns of convergent evolution because you also consider the role of diversification and having a common ancestor. And as I understood, your story was analyzing the case in which certain reproductive strategies that we can associate with sexes has appeared first, and then we say kind of diversification based on that, and then we observe a reconverging on the certain formal property sets, which explains the historical kinds.
Yeah, no, I'm convergent. So it's really hard to put this example, like this cleanly, an example of convergent evolution. I mean, so I thought about how to characterize the example. I mean, but it is, so what isn't convergent like about this? Well, there is this common origin. So usually like classic cases of convergent evolution, you don't point to this common origin and you say despite this wild diversity of starting conditions, you end up, because of certain adaptive strategies always being better, certain strategies always being adaptive, or very commonly, you end up getting the same characteristics. But nevertheless, there is a sense in which this is convergent evolution. You start with this very simple starting condition, then you get a kind of divergence in lots of different ways, but the kind of, and so before the evolution of, on this picture, like internal fertilization and stuff, there might have been other, more dramatic behavioral differences, say, between males and females, but then once that evolved, because it was adaptive in lots of different conditions, then you have sort of downstream and convergent, similar patterns of evolutionary consequences across all those organisms that have evolved the internal fertilization. So yeah, it is a case of convergent evolution, but you're sort of starting from something like the same, then you're diversifying, and then you're sort of converging again.
Other questions? And then Bill after.
I'm wondering what you'd have to say about the evolutionary history of plant sexes. Some plants also are anisogynous. Does your account have anything to say about that case?
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, it would, so plants, so the male and female roles of plants are understood also in terms of gamete size, but plants tend to be dioecious, that is, that each organism produces either both small and large gametes, such as they're did I say it? Yeah, I didn't mean to say dioecious. I meant hermaphroditic, non-dioecious. So in as much as this account is an account of species with separate sexes, most plants sort of wouldn't fall under it, but a deeper issue is that, so how does the sexual cascade work? And what are the patterns that it's trying to explain? They're behavioral patterns that just plants couldn't possibly realize, or at least not in any straightforward way. So part of the repeatability of the sexual cascade in animals has to do with the fact that they evolve neuronal systems with rapid behavior and things like that. So there are background evolutionary requirements that plants just don't, that isn't the path they've taken, at least most of the time, or maybe all the time. I'm being hesitant in case there are any active plant people in the audience that can talk about the dynamics of plant behavior and stuff. But, yes, the combination of the fact that I don't think that anything like the sexual cascade could play out in plants, so it sort of falls, there's a different explanation for any patterns in plant male and female characteristics, and the fact also that plants don't tend to be exclusively male or female. The category of dioecious plants is just much smaller because they're usually hermaphroditic. So the two reasons why they sort of fall outside this project.
Okay, so one thing I was wondering about is whether the account you've given is one that kind of entails that sex division is going to be a binary matter. And I guess looking at your definition, that's going to turn on whether lineage contiguity is one of these things that's an all or nothing matter, or something that can be a matter of degree. And I'm wondering whether it just falls out of the definition of lineage contiguity, that it is, whether it's an empirical question as to whether it is, or in general, what kind of thing that would then turn out to turn on.
So let's see. I think that even before you get to lineage continuity, or sort of thinking about whether there's a fact about what the female lineage is or the male lineage is, I don't think the sexes do have to be binary. If, on my account, if that means that every organism is cleanly male or female. I think my account permits, as Hannah was mentioning, though I didn't think I said it in the PowerPoint, it does permit organisms to be considered female even though they don't produce larger gametes. So it's sort of flexible of variations in sex characteristics. But there could be a case in which an organism came about by sort of just a combination of male and female developmental pathways, and where those are historically defined, and then they wouldn't be either male or female. They would be, or there could be, you could have versions of my criterion that insisted on sort of a larger percentage, if you could possibly quantify these things in terms of one or the other. So there's sort of, it's flexible as far as an organism not being all of them being male and female. I don't think that, in general, scientific categories, scientists themselves care, or they need to care, they should care about there being cases where the categories don't cleanly apply. That doesn't sort of undermine their, scientific or explanatory use. So it's sort of just more consistent with, in various ways, the messiness of biological processes, that there should be intermediate cases.
Other questions? We have one down here. Okay.
I guess I'm confused about this joint sperm base. I didn't quite get your argument. I don't understand why we can't just say that the usage is mistaken. Okay, the usage is consistent with your account, but that doesn't mean that the usage is right anyways. Maybe maybe you should have said that giant sperm producers are male and female.
Mm-hmm. You know, that's definitely an open, that is a kind of response you can give, for sure. That, so I use biological usage as an argument in favor, but maybe the biologists are wrong. They're right about their definition, but they're wrong about how to apply it in this case. They should be applying it more strictly. I mean, I feel like that's a bit of a concession because, you know, in as much as, though I don't think, I mean, because it's better if your account of this biological category, which is sort of, its meaning is sort of pinned down in some sense by biological usage, actually agrees with biological usage. So certainly that's something against the traditional account, that it isn't consistent, although that's an open move. And then, you know, then I would just come back to like, well, what's the use of, like, what's the scientific use of continuing to call these things male? Switching their usage and calling these things female. Like, it isn't the case that in virtue of this large sperm production, these creatures end up, you know, evolve. Like there's no tendency in the future, it seems like, for them to evolve other typically female characteristics. They're already sort of set on their biological path in some sense because of the other entrenched characteristics they have. So yeah, I mean, it would be, you could say, you know, normatively they're making a mistake in usage here, but then you'd have to really give a strong normative account about what the use of that, holding on to that strict definition is.
Got time for one more question. Anybody? Jen.
My question is too simple. I want to clarify your purpose of your presentation. While Dupré is criticizing the claim that species are natural kinds, he relies on two main assumptions, like there's nothing interesting or essential about species and there is no unifying non-essential property under which we can categorize species. And I think he seems to make a similar move while he's talking about sexes, like there's nothing interesting and there's nothing unifying about sexes. Are you targeting the second point?
So yeah, the Dupré setup was mostly just to, it was a setup. It wasn't that nothing Dupré says about kinds is like directly, well, the main thing that I'm disagreeing with Dupré is the claim that the sexes aren't explanatory kinds. So he says, I mean, the first part of it is that because they're not intrinsic kinds that have this particular explanatory form, they must not be explanatory. Of course, his own account is extremely much more permissive than the intrinsic account, but he certainly doesn't he doesn't understand the sexes as I understand the sexes. He doesn't have this historical account. So I'm sort of, you could see me as like filling out, like sort of, no, Dupré, there is this alternative way of understanding the sexes. It's not your really permissive way, like that where even croissants are, a natural kind. But it's this different form of kinds, and these can be explanatory in an interesting way. Like, what do you think about that?
All right, thank you so much.